We know now that Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand were destined to contest 2 World Chess Championship matches. But when they first played together in 2007, Anand was at the top of his game and Carlsen was a prodigy on the rise. Anand struck and gained first blood in their 2 decisive games in Morelia, Linares. Despite winning both of these games, one of them, a great game that we'll look at today, Anand said it was hard to imagine that Carlsen would not be World Chess Champion at some point. The game begins classically with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5, a Ruy Lopez. I'm going to skip through the opening theory here because it's not really the point of the game, but there are lots of great videos you can check out that have more about all of these moves. Anand himself doesn't really get into the meat of what's happening until move 17, and all of these moves have been played thousands and thousands of times, and there are plenty of good choices available for both players up through here. Now, at this point, Carlsen picks something a little interesting with knight d7, which is less popular than queen c7, and Anand also makes a less popular decision here with knight d2 is the main move. He instead chooses pawn d5. I really like this choice by Anand. There's a ton of theory here. I don't know all of it, but what I like about this move is that Anand is closing the position and establishing some pawn chains in the center of the board right here. Now, in a position like this, which has elements of a King's Indian pawn structure, you'd often want to play pawn to f5 for black, but it's really hard to achieve this in this structure for black, and that makes me think that maybe Carlsen's pieces are a little bit misplaced. Maybe it's hard for him to get play here. That certainly proves to be the case over the course of the game, and so I really like this d5 decision by Anand and the structure he chooses to go for right here. So at this point, Carlsen chooses to play knight b6. The knight comes to d2. Carlsen plays g6, which seems a little pointless, I think. So maybe bishop d7 with quicker access to the c file might be a better decision. After pawn g6, Anand strikes with b4. Maybe a better decision here was knight b7 because the c file is going to matter and Anand's going to get there first. But you don't like to pull the knight back to b7 because it's really hard to get it out of b7 in these Ruy Lopez structures. So the c file is opened by Carlsen after an exchange on b4, and after an exchange of knights, Anand plays his novelty bishop b3 here. He's putting pressure on the queen side, putting pressure on this outpost on c4, and putting pressure on general on the c file. All of this seems to give him a nice solid opening advantage where he's really going to ask some good questions of Carlsen. So after bishop b3, we get knight b6, already stepping back and giving up that outpost square. Well, it's hard to believe that's the best move. Maybe bishop d7 is better, but still Anand would be in a stronger position. So bishop e3, bishop d7, rook c1, rook c8, and timing is everything in chess. And now by trading on the c file, Anand is going to win the c file. The problem is that you want to take back with the queen and get a heavy piece onto the c file, but you can't because the knight on b6 is loose right here. Instead, you've got to take with the bishop, and you are further away from challenging the c file than Anand is. So Anand goes ahead now and plays queen c2, putting a major on the c file, and then he comes in with rook c1, eyeing an invasion with queen c7. When you are controlling an open file, you are not controlling an open file just to be like, hey, look at this great real estate I have. It's so nice. I get to pay so much tax on it, right? You are controlling this open file with the purpose of using it for an invasion. That invasion here is queen c7, and it's a big problem. Anand himself recommends a passive defense with knight c8, but still, queen c7 looks very juicy for Anand. It's not clear how he's going to win the game, but it's certainly him who's trying, and he's got the basically only plus in the position that you can have, total domination of the c file, a very nice position. Instead, Carlsen decides to play knight a8, which is super passive, and this knight on a8 makes a really, really poor impression. But he's hoping that if he can deny access to an invasion on the c file, maybe Anand really doesn't have anything and later this knight can come back into the game. I like this try, even though it's going to work out kind of badly for Carlsen in this game. So after knight to a8, Anand switches gears, plays queen d2, queen b8, prepares rook c8, and now Anand switches over to the king side as these dark squares are starting to appear soft over here. He's looking to exchange their defender with bishop g5. Now, one really nice line I have to point out here is pawn to f6. And now, if Anand had to retreat the bishop, there really wouldn't be much of an advantage for Anand at this point, but he doesn't have to retreat the bishop. f6 gets met beautifully with knight takes e5. Now we've got two minor pieces hanging here, and they can be captured in three different ways, but all the ways are losing. First off, the bishop on d7 is hanging. So if you take this bishop, knight just takes on d7, and you're not only picking up that bishop, you're also going to pick up a fork right here. So you're going to go ahead quite a bit of material. If you capture the knight here, of course, this bishop just hangs, and the position is dominant for white, who's already up a pawn and controls everything. And if you capture in the other direction, pawn here, then simply this move is going to create a discovered attack and hit the bishop on e7, again, a crushing position. All very, very beautiful. Not deep calculations, but you love to see moves like knight takes e5. After bishop g5, maybe a better defense was queen d8 in this position. You're giving up your ability to challenge the c-file if you play queen d8, but you are keeping those dark squares covered, and there doesn't seem to be a clear way for Anand to break through against a sturdy move like queen d8. Instead, Carlsen does go ahead and make the exchange here. I think that this is a little bit like his exchange on b4 earlier that open the c-file. I think Carlsen in this game as a young player is a little bit too quick to make exchanges that are working to his opponent's advantage when he's in a difficult position and isn't sure what to do. And that's going to cost him in this game. I think that he probably would have defended more sturdily later, which isn't surprising because he became the best player in the world. So after bishop takes g5, the knight takes on g5, and I want to point out here that maybe the sturdiest defense is actually king g7, getting off of this diagonal for reasons that are going to become really clear in a moment. This move would prepare pawn to h6, and if the knight gets pushed back with h6, then maybe Anand doesn't have a lot, and this might actually be the most resilient option to Carlsen, and maybe he could have defended with this nice move king g7, anticipating Anand's threats, and just covering all of the weak points and getting out of any tactical danger. Instead, after knight takes g5, Carlsen says, this is my moment. I'm challenging the c-file. I'm going to play rook c8. I'm going to exchange rooks, and you're just not going to have enough here to really press me. However, I think Anand's move was probably missed by Carlsen. It's very nice, and I'd pause your video if you want to try and figure out what Anand plays in this position. So at this moment, Anand plays rook to f1. This isn't a sacrifice, so I gave you a little bit of a puzzle, but there was no sacrifice. It seems like a trick. You're supposed to sack the queen when I ask you for a move, right? But what I like about this move that I think would be missed by a lot of amateurs is after we fought so hard to challenge the c-file, to control the c-file, we're now giving it up so that we can switch gears. At this point, we have a lot of pieces pointing towards the black king, and black's pieces to challenge that c-file that we were controlling have buried themselves on the other side of the board. That means it's time to open a new front. We're going to give up the c-file, which is no longer the most relevant file. We can't dominate it anymore. And we're going to open the f file, and that file is going to matter a lot. There's actually a lot of opportunities to play like this in chess. When you have an advantage on one wing and your opponent manages to defend that wing, a lot of times you can switch over to another wing and press them there, and they won't be able to switch over to defend that wing at that point. Generally, it's easier for the attacker to switch pieces to another attacking wing than it is for a defender to switch over new defensive pieces. This is a great case in point right here. So rook to f1 does happen now, and at this point, Carlsen goes ahead and plays pawn to h6. Again, maybe king g7, but it's getting harder to defend at this point. f4 is going to come, and white is going to get an attack. This is another point where you can pause your video and try to figure out if you can play as Anand did. So Anand strikes now. It's time. Knight to e6. This is why we've been looking at king g7, because it would dodge this move. Knight to e6 is a great move that buries this knight deep in black's position, and you can't really take it. I think the most instructive thing in this position is the contrast between the knight on a8 and the knight on e6. And basically, Anand is going to finish off this attack before the knight on a8 can get back. If you capture the knight right here, when the pawn captures back, it's hitting this bishop, and obviously the bishop on b3 that's been stuck behind the pawn on d5 instantly becomes a monster. Bishop e8 and queen takes h6 threatens e7, which is a monster threat. There's also pawn to f4 coming, and basically this attack is winning. Now, you can spend a lot of time analyzing this position to prove it, but I'm going to kind of leave it there. I encourage you to look more at this position if you want to try to figure out how black might try to defend and how white can finish black off. It's not forced. There's a lot of intuition here. Since there's a lot of intuition here for even Anand, we're going to leave it here and say this e7 threat is too strong and white's 3 attacking pieces are too much, and black doesn't really have any useful defenders around. These pieces are stuck on the back rank and aren't covering the critical squares. So instead, Carlsen says, I'm not going to take your knight on e6. I'm just going to play king h7 here and try to hold on. Of course, it's time to open up that rook on f1 that we put right there. Pawn to f4 comes, and we're getting into a situation, by the way, I think, where this knight on e6 is going to be less appealing to capture with every single move because the attack is building. So it gets harder and harder to try to capture this piece. For example, if you try to capture it now with d takes e6, bishop e8, then you just have f5. And this is a critical theme throughout. You're going to play f6. You're going to have 2 connected passed pawns. That's way better than what black has over here with the knight on a8. Those 2 connected passed pawns are going to push through long before the knight on a8 can matter. So you shouldn't even be bothering to count material here. You should just be thinking, I play f6, I play f7, I win the game. The material count is pretty irrelevant at this point. So Carlsen throws in a check, makes sense. It doesn't really change anything, but it's useful to try to get the queen to the 7th rank for defense. So of course, we're just going to sidestep that check. Carlsen tries bishop e8, and now pawn to f5 in this position. Also, f takes e5 was good. You can look at the notes if you want to see that move here. Again, if we ever capture the knight, after a recapture, we will have 2 connected passed pawns. Black cannot stop us from playing f6, f7, and we win the game at that point. So after f5, Carlsen goes ahead and captures here. Pawn takes, and pawn to f6. So at this point, Carlsen says, I can't ever capture that knight on e6. That is true, but the move f6 basically concedes that, you know, I'm losing. Honestly, if you look at this knight on e6, I'm never going to be able to hold. I didn't manage to capture any of your sacrificed material. And of course, the white position is dominating. I have no doubt that Carlsen was sure that this position was lost, and he just couldn't take the knight on e6. There's just nothing better. There's nothing to recommend, but it feels to me like f6 is the admission that there's no way to defend. There's a nice move here from Anand as he plays rook e1. With an eye to swing the rook into the game over here. But after knight c7 from Carlsen, he switches gears with rook c1. I really like this move. I think it's very instructive. Just because you put a rook on one line here doesn't mean that when the position changes, you can't switch over and here create a very, very strong pin. Strong players are always willing to reevaluate. Things have changed. A moment ago, the rook was good on e1. Immediately later, it's better on c1 as we create this pin. So bishop d7 from Carlsen, rook c3, eyeing moves like rook here, and then mate on h6. Pawn to e4, rook to g3, eyeing rook g6, and then just mate on h6. Knight takes e6, pawn takes, the bishop defends here, and pawn e7 is a nice move from Anand. This has a mating threat, and you can see the mate after queen takes e7, bishop check, and we take on h6, and we have mate next move. Instead, after e7, Carlsen tried bishop h5, which by opening up the rook here stops bishop g8 and queen takes h6 mate, but he still resigned after queen takes on d6. Simply queen takes f6 is coming, and when queen takes f6 hits the board, it's going to be mate shortly. This is a really, really beautiful game from Anand. I hope that you like it. It's very, very instructive. As strong as Carlsen was, and he did finish second in this tournament, despite being the last seed, Anand still looks like absolutely the better player here. And, you know, as he is one of the greatest attacking players of all time. If you like this video, please do subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. And do check out the playlist, which has a ton of other great games from Anand.